In this video, we'll be making this 43-inch wide by 9-foot long walnut harvest table with tapered legs. Let's get started. So here I'm just laying out my boards and figuring out what pieces or what boards are going to become what parts of the table. And I'm going to start by cutting down the boards for the top, since they're obviously need to be the longest. And it's a 9-foot table, and as you saw there, I set it a little past 9 foot. We'll cut all these boards to rough length, get them glued up, and then we'll cut them to final length after they're glued up into a panel. Now these boards we bought were already milled on 3 sides, so the 4th side just needs to be squared up, and I'm doing that now on the table saw. And you might check with your supplier. The supplier that we buy from, it's not a huge difference in price between the rough sawn and the stuff that's already squared up on 3 sides. So this is going to be my tabletop. I'm looking at the grain and trying to figure out what looks best beside which board. I try and match up. I don't know if you can see down here on the bottom, that light spot, that's 2 different boards, and I tried to put those together. And obviously you can't do that perfectly. Just do the best you can with that. You can see James in the background. He's working on a mantle. He's taking an old oak beam that we have and making it into a mantle for one of our customers. And I have a video that I've started editing for that, so we'll probably be posting that pretty soon. Now here, as I go through and tighten up my clamps, I just make sure my boards are as flat as possible to each other. They match up as well as I can. And then what I don't get out with that hammer, we'll sand out. And those small clamps are just there until we get the big clamps tightened down. Once they're tightened down, the small clamps can come off. Now this is a big open knot hole, obviously it goes all the way through, so we're going to fill that with epoxy. And I've got some other places I'm going to fill with epoxy, but I'm getting this one started right now because I'm not going to do this all at once. That's too much for one pour with this type of epoxy. If you poured that whole thing at once, it would get hard and extremely hot and brittle. And you want to let it dry slowly. So you need to pour that in 2 pours. So that was 1 pour there. Here I'm cutting up the boards that we'll be gluing up to make our table legs. This is obviously the next day, getting the tabletop out of clamps. And now I'm doing the same thing here that I did with the tabletop. I'm matching up these boards and making sure the outside two look really nice, and trying to make the grain match the best I can on the sides of the other ones. But before I do that, I decide to go ahead and get epoxy poured into my tabletop the rest of the way. This is the next day, so that other epoxy is dried. And there's a few other places that I want to tape just to make sure I don't have any leaks. And that's happened to me many times where I thought I had everything covered and still had a leak somewhere, so that's something that I try to look for really well. And I'll put the tabletop up on blocks like you see there, so if there are any leaks, first of all, you can see them, and secondly, it doesn't attach your tabletop to your workbench. So this is that knot that I partially filled yesterday. I finished filling it today, and I didn't mention it earlier, but I also mixed some walnut sawdust in with that when I filled that hole, and the rest of it I'll just pour clear epoxy in. And if you don't know, if you haven't watched somebody do this before, come back with this propane tank, and I'm just popping the air bubbles in the top of that epoxy. And if you don't do that, they'll dry like that and you'll have bubbles in your epoxy. So now back to our leg blanks. We're going to glue 4 boards up for each leg. The boards are a little over 3/4 thick, and I think our finished legs ended up being 3 1/4 by 3 1/4. Obviously you need to go a little bigger than that to start with, because you've got to mill them down to the right size so they're all square and flat when you get done. Now I'm milling up the rest of my lumber that's going to become the aprons of my table base, and I'm doing the same thing with these. I'm cutting them large because we're going to be gluing them up, and these long boards are actually not long enough to make this 9-foot table. I used all my lumber that long for the top, and these are just a little too short, so you'll see here in a minute how I solved that problem. And it works out well. So I'm just getting all my boards cut to rough length here. And this is what I was talking about. So these are going to be my long aprons. We're going to be taking 2 boards and gluing them together to make the thickness of the apron, because they're not thick enough, but they're also not long enough. So I'm going to use some dowels here and actually glue a short board onto the end of the long board, and that in itself would not be strong enough. I would not recommend doing that, but we're also going to be sandwiching this together with another one, and we'll put those on opposite ends when we glue that up. And with those glued together like that, there's plenty of strength there. If you do it right, that glue bond is going to be stronger than the wood itself. So we've got 4 of these to do, There's only 2 long aprons, but once again we're gluing 2 boards together to make those 2 long aprons, so we'll have 4 of these to make those 2 aprons. And anytime I do something like this, I try and put a clamp above and a clamp below, so you've got even pressure pulling against that. Now here, this is the next day. That joint is dried. I'm just cleaning the glue squeeze out off of those, and I'm getting ready to glue these up. And like I mentioned, we'll have a short board on one end and a short board on the other end. And when you sandwich them together like this, there's plenty of strength there. Now these are the leg blanks. They're out of clamps, and I'm just rough cutting that one edge that's so off. You can see the boards are all different widths there. So I'm just cutting all that off, and they'll go through the joiner and the planer. So these are the leg blades we glued up. We glued 4 boards together to make these, and I did not get on video getting them milled yesterday, but after I took them out of clamps, I ran them through the joiner, ran just a light pass through the planer to make sure these 2 sides that were glued up were parallel after the glue up, and then ran one edge through the joiner and ran the other side through the table saw. And now we've got 4 square good sides, and it's all the same dimension. I sat this between the table saw fence and the blade to get my distance. So then when I ran it through this way, it obviously came out the same size. Now we're going to put tapers on these legs, and we use our tapering jig to do that on the table saw. So we'll set this up and put a taper on the back 2 sides of the legs. And when you're doing that, I always look for, obviously, we want to cut this off while we're doing the taper cut. And then if you don't have something like that, I'll just look at them and try and find, what side is the ugliest. So this one, I'm probably going to take this corner off right here and get rid of that. This one's really 6 1/2 dozen the other. I may take this corner off just because of this huge color difference here. Where this side has color differences, but they blend in a little better. This is really stark. So since there's nothing else worse, then I'll choose this side to take off with the taper. Yeah, I'm setting up the taper jig here, and I actually cut tapers on my first leg before I realize I need to do my mortises in the legs first. It's much easier to do the mortises in the legs with it being a full square like it is right here, rather than having those tapers on it. That just adds problems. Luckily, the table saw doesn't cut all the way through the legs. It's too thick sitting on top of that jig for the blade to make it all the way through. So I still have a full square here on this first leg that I cut, and I'll do the rest of them later. Now my jig has clamps that will hold that leg in place, and I typically use those, but this table leg is too fat for those clamps. Now to cut my mortises in my legs, I need to know how big my tenons are going to be, so I always cut them first. And we cut them with the radial arm saw and the table saw. We cut the face off with the radial arm saw. We keep this saw set at 3/4 of an inch off the tabletop, and we don't move it. I have another radial arm saw sitting beside it, and if there's ever a need to use a radial arm saw for something other than this, we'll use the other saw. This one is only there to make these cuts that you're watching right now. So we're going to use it to cut the face of those off, and it'll leave a 3/4 inch tenon on the back side there. And then we'll take them all over to the table saw here, and we'll do an 1/8 of an inch cut on the bottom of that tenon and a 3/4 inch cut on the top. And we do that, the 1/8 of an inch on the bottom is just enough to hide your mortise, and the 3/4 inch on the top, I like to get as much meat up there as I can, just to give that leg strength. You know, I've in the past I took some pine and glued in a mortise and tenon, and waited several days and tried to break it, and that's what happened. That meat above the tenon broke out. So that's always my biggest fear, so I leave as much meat up there as I can. So I just cut the 1/8 inch on the bottom. I raised the blade up to cut 3/4 inch on the other side, and I'm running the tenons back through, taking that 3/4 inch off the top side of the tenon. And once I get these done, then I can lay them on top of my table legs and lay out my tenon measurements right on the leg, right off the tenon. And that's what I just did there. I marked those. I bring this over to find the center of the leg, and then I can set up the mortiser. So I'm going to line it up with the top of my mortise cut, and then go down to the bottom of the mortise cut, line it up. I'll set up a stop, and then I find the center of the leg there and start cutting. And with that first cut, I'll set my depth, and it's tight, but it fits. So we're going to cut the rest of them. It's set up well, set up right. When you're cutting mortises like this, you always want to cut the top of the mortise and the bottom of the mortise, and then clean out the middle. If you come down through the mortise, by the time you get to the bottom, you don't have anything on the right side holding your chisel in place, and you can get some deflection to where you don't get a good square cut on the end. So I always cut the top of my mortise, the bottom of my mortise, and then clean out the middle. Now we're back to the taper jig, and we'll get the rest of our tapers cut here. And like I said, this table saw blade's not going to go all the way through, so we're going to make these cuts. We'll go over the bandsaw and finish this cut up. We'll stay away from the edge, and then we'll come to a router and clean up that last little bit that the bandsaw left. We'll clean that up with the router. So we're coming over to the router here, and I've got a tall bit on there that has a bearing on the top of it. It's riding on the clean cut from the table saw, and the bottom of it has a blade that's the same size as that bearing, and it's going to clean up the bandsaw cut. And then we're just going to clean all that up with the sander. I always glue up my short side first on my table base, and I'll get that in clamps and let it set overnight, or I might do it in the morning and let it set, throughout the day. And when I clamp it up, I like to put a clamp on both sides, and I'll put one down lower and one a little above the joint, and that way they're kind of pulling against each other, and you get a good solid, you get your joint closed up right on top and bottom, if that makes sense, and left and right. You're getting pull from both directions. This is the next day. We're taking the short sides out of clamps, and we're going to get the long sides glued up. And this will be the same process. I don't have clamps this long, so I'll just use 2 clamps, and they'll meet in the middle. So actually each side will get 4 clamps, 2 on each side. And this works well, so to me it's just impractical. We do a lot of 9 foot, 10 foot, even 12 foot tables, but it's just not practical keeping clamps around that are that long. So this is set for a while. So we'll start getting our last few pieces put on these table bases, on this table base, and we'll get it cleaned up and get ready for finish. First we've got I put corner braces in, and I'll put 1 screw into the leg and then 2 screws into each apron on each side. Before I do that though, I'm going to measure from corner to corner on both sides just to make sure my table base is square, and it was square. If it wasn't square, I would clamp a side down to my workbench there, and then pull my other side over until the base was square, get it clamped in place, and then put all these brackets and stuff on here to hold it square. So I did miss filming all my braces that go across the middle, and how we typically do those, if we have a 6 to 7 foot table, we'll just have 1 brace going across in the middle. 8 to 9 foot tables, we'll do 2 braces like this, and 10, 12, and 14 we'll do 3 braces just evenly spaced between the legs there. Now I'm using a 1/2 inch roundover bit on this, so it's a heavy roundover, but it looks really nice on a piece like this, that big roundover especially on a tapered leg like this. And I know a lot of people will do their roundovers before they put their piece together. I've done that in the past, and it just bit me in the butt. Because I had something that needed to go together that shouldn't have been rounded over and was. So I like to get it all put together, and then I'll do my roundover. And it's hard to get to the ends, but I'll just even that out with the sander, and that just seems to work better for me. If I gave it enough thought, I'm sure I could avoid that, but this is a way I don't have to think about it and still avoid that. So I'm just cleaning up the last little bit of glue up on the top, squeeze out on the top here that I couldn't get to before. And I missed talking about it, but a minute ago while I was talking, I got the biscuit joiner out, and I put slots around the table base there, and we'll use those slots later to attach the top to the base. Now I sanded this to 120. I went through with a wet washcloth to pop the grain and sanded it again. Now we're carrying it into the finish room back there. We didn't film finishing the table. We just put Rubio monocoat on it. At this point, we've got finish on the table, and we're putting our feet on and getting ready to this table's done. You know, as we're drilling our holes for the feet, we'll drop a foot in the hole just to make sure it's deep enough before we put our insert in there. So there's the table base. It has the feet on it. Here comes the top that's coming out of our finish room back there. Last thing to do is to get those table clips, or to get the tabletop clips put on, attach the top to the base, and we're done. So we're just going to use those clips. I think I used 10 of them. Three on each end, one on each of the braces in the middle there, and then 2 on the aprons in the middle. And this table's done. I appreciate you guys watching. We're going to continue making videos. Please like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, make sure you leave them in the bottom. If you have any suggestions for how we can make our videos better, I'd love to see that in the comments below. Thanks.